Operation Berlin must be tonight.
This was the code name for the withdrawal plan. This was an extremely difficult task for the 1st Airborne Division, as they were very weak by this point. Additionally, if the Germans got wind of the evacuation plan, they would be sure to cut the Tommies off from the riverbank. Now, under the circumstances, the plan for Operation Berlin was ingenious. Urquhart radioed Major General Thomas to plan the finer details.
You know how they did in Gallipoli, Charles? Well, we've got to do something like that.
Urquhart was well versed in the First World War evacuation plan of Gallipoli, having studied it for an exam for promotion. One element of the plan was vital: defence until the very last minute. Simultaneously, forward positions would be thinned out and evacuated towards the riverbank. The division would withdraw from top to bottom, with the troops furthest north withdrawing first, and so on. Unfortunately, Urquhart could not take all the wounded with him. As a result, he made the difficult decision to leave the non-walking wounded behind, and those wounded who could man positions would do so to create the illusion that nothing had altered. The majority of the medical staff stayed behind, with the addition of a handful of radio operators.
Hello, Dog Easy Fox.
Who stayed on hand to transmit false radio traffic, to confuse the Germans, and lead them to believe that nothing had changed. Meanwhile, the Light Regiment and 30 Corps had put together an elaborate fire plan to suppress the Germans to the last possible minute, to further add to the ruse so they would not become suspicious. Stealth was vitally important. As a result, the men of the 1st Airborne Division blackened their faces, tied down their weapons, and put rags on their boots to reduce as much noise as possible.
One thing more. Get some sacking, dishcloths or what have you, and get these number 9s wrapped up. We've got to be dead quiet this trip.
Additionally, they destroyed as much equipment left behind as they could, so it would not fall into the hands of the Germans. After dark on the 25th, the withdrawal began. The men furthest north stealthily evacuated their positions and made their way towards the embarkation point on the Rhine River bank, closely followed by the next group. This pattern was continued throughout the night, with the troops furthest north evacuating first, and those to the south falling in behind them. However, some British units were so cut off that it was impossible to inform them of the evacuation. One example of this was D Company of the 1st Border Regiment, cut off and surrounded. Only 5 men managed to escape. The Glider Pilot Regiment had created escape routes marked with tape and acted as guides. Even so, the evacuation was far from breezy, made worse by heavy rain. Some men walked directly into German patrols and subsequently were taken prisoner. Despite the confusion, the men at the embarkation point remained calm and the situation remained organised. Priority for evacuation was given to the walking wounded. However, apart from this, and despite rank, the position in which the men arrived at the embarkation point denoted their position in the queue, and they waited there and boarded in an orderly fashion. The ferrying of the men from the north side of the river to the safety of the south began at 2200 hours, with complements of the 23rd Canadian Field Company and 12 powered boats. Additionally, chaps of Wessex Division assisted with paddle boats. Unfortunately, a miscommunication had led 30 Corps to believe that the 4th Dorsets had captured enough of the Westerborring high ground to evacuate the Brits from this area. Around 50% of the boats spent the night crossing here and managed to evacuate 48 men, the majority of which were from the Dorsets, who had been forced into hiding here after the mishaps of the previous evening. By the time it was identified that the British Airborne had no intention of evacuating from the Westerborring high ground, unfortunately it was too late to redeploy the boats to aid with the main evacuation. Nonetheless, Operation Berlin was making good progress. Sappers manning the boats had experienced little interference from the Germans for several hours. The Canadians, however, had not been so lucky, having found that the engines on their boats to be problematic. It was only a matter of time before the Germans became aware of the crossings. Although identifying that the crossings were taking place, the Germans believed that it was in fact an attempt to reinforce the Brits on the north side of the river and not an evacuation. As a result, the Germans began to fire upon the boats, but shell suitable landing points on the north side of the river for landing supplies. Unfortunately, as the night drew on, increasing interference from the Germans and continued engine problems from the boats resulted in a reduced level of men being able to be evacuated. Sadly, some men did become casualties. An estimated 150 crossings were made on the night of the 25th, primarily made by the Canadian 23rd Field Company, reporting 11 casualties. Sappers of the 260th Wessex Division were extremely lucky, with no casualties reported. Nevertheless, exhaustion meant that as the night drew on, fewer and fewer men were able to man the boats. As dawn approached, the majority of men on the north side of the river had been successfully evacuated. However, some did remain, and they were left with a serious dilemma: either be captured by the Germans, or attempt to swim the fast-flowing Rhine River. Many of the men didn't really fancy spending the rest of the war in a German prison camp, and consequently, the majority of the men stripped down and attempted to swim the river.
That last boat's had it. I'm going to swim for it. Let the man for himself.
Now, the Rhine is wide and it is fast-flowing, and consequently, many of them were swept downstream into German positions and were captured, and sadly, some never made it at all. It took until the following day for the Germans to grasp the true magnitude of what had happened the previous evening. As they began their daily thrust upon the British positions, they realised Operation Market Garden was in fact over. The dream to end the war by Christmas was no more. However, determination and British and Canadian ingenuity had led to 2,400 men being successfully evacuated to safety, a truly momentous achievement in the wake of such disastrous events. Here's to the men of the 1st British Airborne Division and 30 Corps, not forgetting the Canadians, who were so often overlooked. Also, let us remember the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, who fought so bravely to keep the route open for 30 Corps.